News Radio 700 WLW.
Don't wanna be an American idiot.
Scott Sloan out, Ken Brew in. It's Monday. Great to have you with us as we begin yet another week. Maybe you're listening at work, and we appreciate that. We really do. But if you're at work, does your company have any kind of a blueprint, a guideline, a handbook, anything for you to look at when topics turn to things political? And let's face it, everything in this day and age is political. I sit here on this radio show, I do this show, and sometimes I'll say something that's complimentary or something that maybe enhances an argument from the right, and all of a sudden, people want to send me emails. They want to castigate me for being some sort of MAGA lover. Or I'll say something that I think might be something that the current administration has done well, and all of a sudden people are accusing me of defending somebody with dementia, that, you know, I'm just one of those libs that shouldn't have a job anyplace, anytime, anywhere. You can't open your mouth anytime, any place, it seems like, let alone the radio, with people wanting to label you other than someone who just has an opinion that something may not be as it appears. But there was a survey done by a company called Gartner in July, and it found that 1 in 4 businesses do not provide any resources, none, zero, to help manage workplace tension among these tense political and social times that we live in. In fact, the old wisdom of don't talk publicly about politics and religion, let alone sex, doesn't really apply anymore realistically to the workplace. 20%, 80%, I should say, 80% of human resource professionals that were surveyed back in 2020, so just a couple of years ago, said their organizations didn't have any guidelines in place for talking about politics at work. And now we have the specter of a sitting president who had his house raided and quite possibly could be facing some sort of legal jeopardy. We have conversation about that everywhere, so why not at work? We have the Dobbs decision that came down in the Supreme Court earlier this summer that basically ended Roe v. Wade protection, and that has to be a conversation everywhere, and everywhere would include work. And it would lead to, one would think, inflammatory conversations that may detract from productivity at work. So what is an employer to do, and what are these organizations, 25% of them that were surveyed, what are they thinking if they don't have any guidelines in place for when things get a little heated, you know, on the job? Standing by is somebody who knows all about this stuff because he is a workplace expert. In fact, he heads up the Vested Group, always one of the top places to work at on any list that ever comes out. He's our good buddy, Joel Patterson. Joel, how are you on this glorious Monday?
I am doing well, Ken. How about yourself?
I'm doing well because, you know, as well as you can do in a business that tries to elicit conversation and thought, and whenever that happens, you get people that think you're either crazy or an apologist for someone. But on many, many jobs where it's not that dynamic, it's just get the job done, go home at night, have dinner, come back again tomorrow, these topics pop up. And unfortunately, they lead at times to conflict. I'm actually absolutely stunned that the number is 25%. 25% of businesses have no metrics, no sense of balance in place to handle these conversations when they come up at work. I'm stunned by that number. Are you?
Yeah, it does seem excessively low given where we've been over the last couple of years. I mean, you already kind of touched on the big ones, you know, social activism and politics and Trump in general and COVID and religion. I mean, we used to not talk about it, but there's no way people aren't going to talk about it, especially over the last couple of years. And even if a company doesn't have a formal policy, they have to be able to recognize that there's a potential conflict or tension that's going to be created by this, and at least need to be able to have a conversation to the organization and say, hey, let's not do this, or let's be careful about this. Every company is going to have a little bit of a different way to look at this, and that's fine. You can't legislate everything that somebody's going to do in your company, but you've got to get to a point where you can hold people accountable if they cross the line. You've got to be able to define what that line is, because sometimes it's just somebody sharing an opinion, but because we're in the time that we are. People get really wound up about that stuff. So you've got to understand, what crosses that. And then ultimately, whatever you decide as a leader in your company, make sure if somebody does something that runs afoul of your policy, what are you going to do about it? Because if somebody doesn't do anything, it's a double negative at that point, which I guess is a positive, but you know what I mean?
Sure.
You've got to make sure that you've got some follow-through and accountability if you really want to be able to impact anything. But I would caution you there, too, because the more you try to legislate that, the more you try to say you can't talk about this or you can talk about that, it really does open up a can of worms where there's no way you can keep up with all of that. So you really got to look at your organization and balance your culture versus, the productivity versus the risk of somebody getting upset and see what the right decision is for you.
Yeah, right. Because once you say you can't do this, you can't talk about religion, you can't talk about politics, well, then all you're doing at that point is you're just opening up criteria down the road. And the other side of that, though, I think is interesting, where if you don't do that, you're then dealing literally with every single instance that comes up, and you have your middle managers, maybe you, I don't know, depending on the size of your company, but you're having your middle managers basically become referees at that point. And so if you have an employee or a handful of employees that become a problem and they want to start these conversations, you're spending a lot of equity on that particular problem as opposed to getting the job done and the product out the door. So they're really, either side of you can't do it or, well, we'll deal with it on an individual basis, you're going to expel some energy on this regardless, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And you've got to kind of start with a conversation. If you don't have a policy now, start with that conversation because you mentioned it. Usually it's a couple of people that like to stir things up in organizations. It's not the whole group. And if you can start with that and really try to relay to them, hey, this is where this is creating an issue. I remember when the election was going on. Campaign buttons, T-shirts, MAGA hats, all those things create potential issues for somebody else on the other side of the screen or the table, and they may not say anything. And that creates consternation for them and stress, and maybe they get angry. There's so many downstream impacts that people don't even realize that as soon as you do hear about it, it's critical that you have a conversation, go into that conversation with the right mindset, and make sure you kind of check your own biases at the door, but really listen to what's going on. And then, if you can't get to where you need to go, that's when you're going to have to step back and say, all right, what is the policy going to be? Are we outlawing campaign buttons and other things? Again, I go back to what I was saying before. Some cultures, they might say, I have to do that. I got to be very strict about this. Most cultures, the most effective ones, I should say, are the ones that are able to have that conversation, treat people like adults, and move through it, and then recognize if it's not happening quick enough, then, yeah, you're going to have to dig in and create a policy for it.
Right. Everybody goes through those training sessions, those online training sessions for situations just like this, where, hey, if you're not comfortable or some kind of conversation happens, you're not comfortable with it, go see your manager will deal with it. As I said, you're going to expend and expel a lot of energy if one way or the other. But I think companies are starting to understand this a little bit better at the corner office level. I remember there were a lot of companies that Black Lives Matter, for example, that they became very vocal in support of that. Well, when Roe v. Wade came before the Supreme Court and the Dobbs decision was handed down, there were fewer companies that spoke out about that because they realized that at their level, they're in, as Michael Jordan famously said, Republicans buy sneakers too. So I think at the top they're beginning to realize that you really can't have that out there if you're selling a product. A company planting a flag and taking a real hard stance on anything. Your job there is to keep the stockholders happy, make as much money as possible. So it would stand to reason if it's coming that way from the top, it would have to filter down to the employees who are actually doing the work and helping that particular CEO or that board make the kind of money that they're expecting to make. You can't have one without the other, I suppose, is my point.
Yeah, it is a slippery slope. I mean, if you go back a few months, you recall Coinbase was one. There was a lot of political activism going on, and their CEO came out and said, no more conversations about it, completely outlawed it, and like a third of his employees resigned because it wasn't just politics. It was everything outside of work. I only want to talk about work. And I think in most places, that's not realistic. You know, I mean, I realize people go to the office for 8 hours, but how much work do you really do in 8 hours? Everybody kind of has a conversation with somebody on the side or whatever. And you need that, really, to be able to just kind of stay focused at the other times. And sometimes those conversations are going to be things that, you know, have nothing to do with work. And so you're right. The C-suite, they're understanding that. The important thing there is that they set an example. So whatever policy they put in place, they have to make sure that they set an example, behave the way that they would want others to behave, maybe keep political programs off the TVs if you've got them at your office. There's little things like that that can make a big difference. Yeah. But ultimately, I still go back to whatever you think makes sense for your organization when you can sit across the table and have a conversation with somebody and maybe let them know that they upset somebody else or whatever it might be. We've got to be able to have some conflict in the organization in order to move forward, whether it's business or not business. And so hopefully you've got a policy and a culture in place that allows you to have that conversation.
And I would, by the way, we're chatting with Joel Patterson, workplace expert with the Vested Group. I have to believe that this is more of a problem now than what it was in 2019. One, there's been an election, but there's also been a lot of people that have been away from the workplace because of COVID that are now gradually, if not in force, coming back to the workplace and not working remotely. So those conversations that were, I suppose, bubbling beneath the surface before all of this, before COVID, Black Lives Matter, the George Floyd killing, the Roe v. Wade decision, the election, MAG and all that, it's now back, but it's more intense. And so 25%, I thought that number was low too, but I don't know. It may be that the other 75% of these organizations might have been okay by what they were viewing before March of 2020, but maybe not. I think this could be more of a problem now than what it was 2.5 years ago. What about you?
Oh, no, I totally agree. I think that everything is, I read an article the other day that everybody going back to office, now they're having air conditioning arguments. So we're really going back to the stuff that was important in 2019 and then throw all the other stuff that happened over the last couple of years on top of it. There's no way it's not going to create additional conflict at times in your office as people get back together. I mean, they've been apart for a long time. They're going to start throwing that stuff together. And you got to keep an eye on it and make sure it doesn't get out of hand. On one hand, it's really good because you want them to be able to bond, and whether they agree or not, a lot of people can have that conversation and not walk away angry with each other. So you like that camaraderie, but there's a limit, and certainly there are topics that stretch the boundaries a little bit.
Absolutely, absolutely. Joel Patterson, you can find him at thevested.com. It's always great hearing your voice and catching up to you, Joel. Stay well. We'll visit down the road. Thanks.
Thank you, Ken. You do the same.